Next week, the teeth of the Russian devils will gnash ever harder, and their rabid mouths will foam in uncontrollable frenzy, as the world will see a favorite Kremlin propagandist pay for their crimes.
That was the voice of Sarah Ashton Cirillo, an American who now leads Ukraine's military propaganda outreach to English-speaking audiences. Among her earlier public relations stunts, Ashton Cirillo made headlines in the U.S. in 2021 with a claimed infiltration of the Proud Boys. She was given the position in Ukraine early last month. The U.S.-installed government in Kiev has boasted about orchestrating the murders of journalist Darya Dugina in August of 2022 and military blogger Vladlen Tartarsky in April of this year. In July, Russia's Federal Security Service captured a group that allegedly intended to assassinate RT's editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonian, and journalist Ksenia Sobchak on behalf of Kiev. There is a kill list maintained by the so-called Center for Countering Disinformation, operating under the Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. That list, issued by the CCD on July 14, 2022, named more than 70 leading journalists, academics, politicians, and military and other professionals from 22 countries as Kremlin propagandists. The list includes U.S. Senator Rand Paul, military analyst and former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, former CIA analyst Ray McGovern, former state senator Colonel Richard Black, retired, New York-based candidate for the U.S. Senate Diane Sayre, and former U.S. Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard. Dan Kovalik is a law professor, attorney, and journalist based in Pittsburgh. We spoke with him there via Skype Thursday. You heard the warning. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a real warning. I mean, because we know that Ukraine has been killing journalists and arresting journalists. It now has Chilean-American journalist Gonzalo Lira in custody. A Ukrainian terrorist killed a journalist in a cafe in St. Petersburg earlier this year. Of course, killed the daughter of Alexander Dugina. So, yeah, I think it's a real warning. You know, obviously the deliverer of the message is strange in a certain way, but makes sense, I think, from a perspective of trying to gain over Western supporters.
I saw Patrick Lancaster's name on there, for example. I haven't perused it in a while. And anyone else we know on this? They got that kill list.
Oh, yeah. The Ukrainian kill list. Yeah, there's a lot of people on there. I think Eva Bartlett is on there.
Jesus. There's
actually a 14-year-old girl on there I've been interviewed by. She lives in Luhansk.
Mm-hmm.
I think Henry Kissinger's on there, strangely enough, because he said at one point that, they should find a negotiated solution to the war. Those are the people, at least, that come to mind immediately.
Yeah, so I'd just like to remind people, you have American citizens on this list. These killings are extrajudicial killings, no matter how they term them. They have no jurisdiction over people in the United States or in Russia, for example. And if they were going to exercise that, the process is spelled out in Geneva. You serve papers on the embassy, and there's a whatever process if there are treaties or not for extradition. Period. That's the law. So they're illegal, and when you illegally kill people or threaten to kill people under international law, that's terrorism. And the president of the United States and the U.S. government are barred from dealing with terrorists. I believe there's still a death penalty attached to that. So how do they justify funding with extraordinary funds people that are making terrorist threats against American citizens?
Well, as you know, the U.S. has been funding terrorism for as long as terrorism has existed, at least. Right. Certainly beginning with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which morphed into Al-Qaeda and ISIS as well. I mean, the U.S. supports terrorists and terrorism all the time when it suits its ends. And in the case of Ukraine, of course, it doesn't seem there's any red line that Ukraine could cross that would cause the U.S. to stop supporting them, frankly. And when something outrageous like this happens, that a spokesperson for Ukraine calls for the murder of journalists, the Western press and Western government simply ignores it, pretends it didn't happen.
If I were a journalist in the United States that's not on the list, I think I am, but say at the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN or wherever, I would still not encourage this practice, just in case I accidentally ran afoul of someone who is in, favorable grace with Langley at the moment, knowing that I could be killed for speaking out of turn or so. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they want American journalists to have this hanging over their heads.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. That is how journalists should react to this, right? They should have solidarity and empathy for other journalists under attack and under threat. But we don't see that these days very often. We don't see an outcry over Julian Assange, for example. Okay. And, the Western journalists are just as apt to call other journalists who they don't like Putin's, pawns for Putin, for example, to vilify others that have a different view on Ukraine as being somehow less than journalists, right? And being, simply tools of propaganda. So, that's part of the problem, right? That there isn't this solidarity amongst journalists that there should be.
And then, I'm assuming somewhere else in the law, to the extent it survived the Patriot Act and everything that's happened since, I guess, that the U.S. government can't use, your tax dollars to kill you or to have some agent kill you. I assume that that's a legal problem for somebody, too. Where do you go with these things, first of all? Who would you bring a complaint to start a process?
Well, probably you try to bring it against the person who made this threat, who I believe is an American, by the way. I'm pretty sure. Right.
From Las Vegas, I think.
What's that?
I think from Las Vegas. If you run that person's name in YouTube, there's an incredible amount of footage in there on all kinds of subjects. This is something that they should have bleached before making this person a spokesperson for the brave Ukrainian military.
Yeah, so I think that that's a place to start anyway, is to bring some sort of case against that person. I mean, I think that would make total sense, and the U.S. would have jurisdiction over that.
And certainly they're in a position to serve papers from time to time. I mean, half of Congress goes over there. It's almost like the Knesset when they go over. It's the, same frequency and some of the same characters that go pay homage.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, looking at this, looking at people that are trying to cover, that are covering what's going on the other side, the people that are being shot at by the Ukrainians with U.S. and U.K. and EU weaponry. There are journalists like Ava Bartlett and Patrick Lancaster and yourself and others that go, behind the lines, so to speak, to show us what goes on. It's hard enough getting that stuff out on the air here, but we do that here at KPFK. And what would you suggest, obviously they're trying to shut the window on these things. What would you suggest to try to pry it open further?
Well, I mean, the thing we need to do is to make it public and, to educate people about this. Again, people by and large, don't know that these threats are being made. They don't know journalists are being arrested and killed by Ukrainian forces. And, I think at least the place we need to start is to educate people and say, hey, this is what's happening. And therefore, why are we, sending billions of dollars in military assistance to a regime that does this? And that also, by the way, destroys Orthodox churches and, has, of course, Nazis in their ranks. These are all fair game. To be questioned. But again, there's just not enough journalists questioning these things. And so we need to be doing that.
And we are. Thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.